No one dared speak to the billionaire's mother. Then one cleaning lady did the unthinkable. "You have exactly 30 seconds to get out of my house before I call the police and tell them you stole my jewelry." Margaret Whitmore's words cut through the silence of the grand hall like a sharp blade. Her cold eyes were fixed on the young black woman standing before her, still holding a cleaning cloth in her trembling hands. Grace Williams was only 28 years old and had been working at the Whitmore mansion for exactly 11 days. 11 days of daily humiliation. 11 days of hearing that people like her shouldn't touch valuable objects. 11 days of swallowing insults that would make anyone else quit. In the first week, Margaret had accidentally knocked over a crystal vase and blamed Grace for the damage. In the second week, she demanded that Grace clean the guest bathroom 3 times in a row, claiming she could still smell the scent of poverty. The other staff members lowered their eyes when this happened. No one interfered. No one dared. But Grace didn't give up. And at that moment, while 23 employees watched in terrified silence, she did something no employee had ever done in Margaret Whitmore's 15 years of reign in that mansion. She didn't leave. "With all due respect, Mrs. Whitmore," Grace said calmly, her voice steady as a rock, "I didn't steal anything. And I'm not leaving until you check the security cameras." A collective gasp swept through the hall. The other staff members instinctively stepped back, as if expecting lightning to strike this bold young woman. Helena, the cook who had worked there for 12 years, covered her mouth with her hands. The older gardener slowly shook his head, like someone watching a funeral. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just the mother of Jonathan Whitmore, the CEO of Whitmore Industries, one of the largest tech companies in the country. She was the true ruler of that house. The woman who had fired more than 60 employees in the last 5 years. The woman whose icy stare made 6-foot security guards tremble. The woman who once destroyed a driver's career simply because he arrived 2 minutes late. And now, a simple cleaning lady was challenging her authority. "How dare you?" Margaret hissed, her face twisted with fury. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do to your miserable life? With one phone call, I can guarantee you'll never work anywhere in this city again." Grace remained motionless. Her heart was pounding, but her eyes didn't waver. She had mentally rehearsed this moment for months. Every insult she swallowed, every humiliation she endured, it was all part of a bigger plan. What no one in that hall knew was that Grace Williams wasn't there by accident. 3 months earlier, she had received an anonymous letter containing information that would change everything. Information about Margaret Whitmore. Information about a secret buried 20 years ago. A secret involving a woman named Rose Williams, the mother Grace lost when she was only 8 years old. "I know exactly who you are," Grace replied softly. "The question is, do you know who I am?" For a fraction of a second, something flashed in Margaret's eyes. Something that looked like fear. But it disappeared as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the mask of arrogance she always wore. "Security!" Margaret shouted, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Get this woman off my property now. And make sure she never passes through that gate again." 2 security guards approached hesitantly. One of them, a man named David who had always treated Grace with kindness, murmured an apology as he held her arm. Grace didn't resist. She just looked directly into Margaret's eyes and said something that made the matriarch freeze. "Ask your son about the Sunrise Foundation. Ask him what happened in 2004. Margaret's face lost all color. Her hands, always so controlled, began to tremble visibly. The pearl necklace around her neck swayed with her quickened breathing. "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice suddenly hoarse. Who told you that?" But Grace was already being escorted out. And as she walked through the long marble corridor, she passed the portraits of the Whitmore family on the walls. Generations of white, privileged faces looking down at her with silent contempt. And then, at the end of the hallway, she saw something no one else noticed. Jonathan Whitmore was standing at the top of the stairs, still wearing his office suit, watching everything in silence. His eyes didn't show the same coldness as his mother's. There was something there. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe something deeper. Their eyes met for a brief moment. And Grace knew at that instant that the next few weeks would change the fate of everyone in that mansion. Because Grace Williams wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was the daughter of Rose Williams, a woman Margaret Whitmore had destroyed 2 decades ago. A woman whose name had been erased from the family's history. A woman who deserved justice. And Grace had waited 20 years for this moment. Outside the mansion, as the golden gates closed behind her, Grace took out her phone and made a call. "Aunt Dolores," she said calmly. "I'm in." She took the bait. On the other end of the line, a tired voice heavy with emotion replied, "Be careful, my child. Margaret Whitmore destroyed your mother. She won't hesitate to destroy you too." Grace looked at the imposing mansion one last time. The lights from the windows glowed like watchful eyes in the evening darkness. "That's exactly why I'm here, Auntie. For Mom. For justice." The cold autumn wind blew through the garden trees, carrying with it the weight of secrets about to be revealed. And as Grace walked toward the bus stop, a subtle smile appeared on her lips. The game had begun. And for the first time in 20 years, Margaret Whitmore wasn't in control. If this story of courage and secrets has hooked you so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out what really happened in 2004 and why Margaret Whitmore was so terrified of a simple cleaning lady. 3 days after being expelled from the mansion, Grace was sitting in the small kitchen of her Aunt Dolores's apartment, surrounded by yellowed papers and old photographs. "Your mother was the best person I ever knew," Dolores said, placing a cup of tea in front of her niece. Her eyes carried the weight of 2 decades of silence. Rose worked for the Whitmores for 7 years. She was Margaret's personal assistant. She knew all that family's secrets. Grace picked up a faded photo. Her mother, young and smiling, stood next to a very different Margaret Whitmore from the cruel woman she had met. They almost looked like friends. "What happened, Auntie? What really happened in 2004? Dolores took a deep breath. The Sunrise Foundation was a charity project the Whitmores created to help low-income families. Millions of dollars in donations. Your mother discovered that Margaret was diverting that money to personal accounts. When Rose threatened to report it, Margaret destroyed her." Grace felt her stomach turn. Destroyed her how? "She planted false evidence. Made it look like Rose was the thief. Your mother was arrested, Grace. She spent 8 months in jail for a crime she didn't commit. When she got out, she was broken. No one would hire her. She lost everything." Dolores wiped away a tear. Depression consumed her little by little. "You were only 8 years old when she..." Dolores couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Grace closed her eyes, letting the pain wash over her completely. She had always known her mother died of illness, as her aunt used to say when she was a child. Only at 18 did she discover the truth about the suicide. And only 3 months ago, through that anonymous letter, did she discover the reason. "Who sent the letter?" Grace asked. "I don't know. But whoever it was has access to privileged information. Bank documents, foundation records, everything we need to prove the truth." That same night, something unexpected happened. Grace's phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Miss Williams." A male voice, formal but not hostile. "Who is this?" "My name is Richard. I'm Jonathan Whitmore's personal assistant. Mr. Whitmore would like to meet with you tomorrow." Discreetly. Grace almost dropped the phone. "Why?" "He didn't tell me. He only asked me to deliver the invitation. Meridian Cafe, downtown, at 10 in the morning. He'll be alone." The call ended. Grace looked at her aunt, her heart racing. "Jonathan Whitmore wants to meet me." Dolores's eyes widened. "It could be a trap, Grace. Margaret could be behind this. Or it could be our chance." The next morning, Grace entered the Meridian Cafe wearing her best dress, the only one she owned for special occasions. Jonathan was already there, at a discreet table in the back of the establishment. Up close, he looked younger than he had at the mansion. More human. "Thank you for coming," he said, indicating the chair across from him. "I imagine you're confused. I'm waiting to find out if you're like your mother or not." Jonathan smiled sadly. "That's a question I've been asking myself for years." He paused. "I saw what happened in the hall. I saw how you stood up to my mother. No one has ever done that. And did that impress you or irritate you?" "It intrigued me." He leaned forward. "You mentioned the Sunrise Foundation. You mentioned 2004. My mother hasn't slept well for 3 days because of those words. What do you know? Grace measured her next words carefully. I know your family built an empire on lies. I know innocent people were destroyed to protect secrets. And I know my mother was one of them. Jonathan's face changed. Your mother. Rose Williams. She worked for your family until 2004. She was arrested for a crime she didn't commit. She died 5 years later, never able to prove her innocence. Jonathan was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I was only 12 in 2004. I remember a woman who worked at the house. I remember she suddenly disappeared. My mother said she had stolen money. Your mother lied. Do you have proof? Grace stared directly at him. I'm gathering it. Jonathan nodded slowly. Then he did something Grace didn't expect. He took a card from his pocket and slid it across the table. This is my personal number. If you have real proof, I want to see it. My mother. He hesitated. My mother has made many mistakes over the years. I turned a blind eye to most of them. But if she destroyed an innocent life, I need to know. Grace took the card. Why are you doing this? She's your mother. Jonathan looked out the cafe window, his expression heavy with what seemed like accumulated guilt. Because for years I've pretended not to see who she really is. And I'm tired of pretending. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore mansion, Margaret was on the phone with her private lawyer. I want you to find out everything about this Grace Williams. Where she lives, where she works, who her family is, everything. And I want you to make her disappear before this becomes a bigger problem. She hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens. You thought you could threaten me, you foolish girl, Margaret muttered to herself. You don't know who you're dealing with. I've destroyed people far more powerful than you. What Margaret didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Grace was receiving a second anonymous envelope. Inside was a list of names, dates, and amounts, all connected to the Sunrise Foundation. And at the end of the list, a handwritten note. The key is in the safe in her office. Third drawer. Code 0409. The date your mother was arrested. Grace looked at that paper, her hands trembling. Someone inside the mansion was helping her. Someone who knew Margaret's secrets. Someone who wanted to see her fall just as much as Grace did. The question was, who? And more importantly, why? The puzzle pieces were falling into place one by one. And very soon, Margaret Whitmore would discover that the castle of lies she had built over 20 years was about to crumble. 2 weeks later, the Whitmore mansion was prepared for the most important event of the year, the family's annual charity ball, with more than 300 distinguished guests, including politicians, businessmen, and celebrities. Ironically, the event celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Sunrise Foundation. Grace watched the commotion from outside, hidden in a car parked a block away. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Beside her, Aunt Dolores held her hand. You don't have to do this, Dolores said. We can turn the evidence over to the police and let them handle the rest. No, Auntie. Margaret spent 20 years living like a queen while my mother rotted in a cell. She's going to look into my eyes when everything falls apart. Grace's phone vibrated. A message from Jonathan. Everything's ready. Service entrance. Unlocked. My mother is in the main hall. You have 20 minutes before her speech. Grace took a deep breath and got out of the car. Getting into the mansion was easier than she had imagined. Jonathan had made sure the guards at the service entrance would be occupied elsewhere. Grace crossed the corridors she knew well from her 11 days as a cleaning lady, silently climbing to Margaret's private office. The door was locked, but the code the anonymous informant had provided worked perfectly. The office was exactly as Grace had imagined, elegant, cold, full of portraits of Margaret herself in majestic poses. Third drawer. Code 0409. Grace's hands trembled as she typed the numbers into the small safe built into the drawer. A soft click. The door opened. Inside was a thick black folder. Grace opened it and felt the air leave her lungs. It was decades of documented crimes. Bank statements showing transfers from the Sunrise Foundation to Margaret's personal accounts. Forged contracts. Emails threatening people who discovered the truth. And at the bottom of the folder, something that made Grace cry silently. A handwritten letter from her mother, dated 2004, addressed to the Foundation's board, reporting all of Margaret's crimes. A letter that was never delivered. A letter Margaret had intercepted and kept as a trophy. "Mom," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm going to finish what you started." 15 minutes later, Grace was positioned at the back of the grand ballroom, invisible among the waiters and service staff. On the makeshift stage, Margaret Whitmore sparkled in her gala dress, smiling for the cameras as she prepared to give her annual speech on philanthropy and generosity. Jonathan sat in the front row, his face tense. His eyes met Grace's for a brief moment. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "Dear friends," Margaret began, her honeyed voice echoing through the speakers, 20 years ago, my family created the Sunrise Foundation with a single purpose: to help those less fortunate find hope." That's when the giant screens behind her flickered. Margaret's smiling face was replaced by documents. Bank statements. $1 million transfers. A detailed timeline showing how, over 2 decades, she had embezzled more than $12 million from the foundation into personal accounts. A shocked murmur swept through the hall. Margaret turned around, her smile freezing on her face. What's happening? Turn this off immediately." But the images continued. Now they showed a photo of Rose Williams, young and smiling, next to the newspaper headline about her arrest in 2004. Then the letter Rose had written, reporting Margaret, the letter that never reached its destination. "Who's doing this?" Margaret screamed, completely losing her composure. "Security!" That's when Grace walked forward, crossing the silent hall. The guests moved aside, making way for this young black woman who walked with the dignity of a queen. "It was me," Grace said, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Grace Williams. Daughter of Rose Williams, the woman you destroyed 20 years ago." Margaret's face went white as paper. You have no right." "I have every right." Grace climbed the steps of the stage, stopping a few feet from Margaret. "My mother discovered your crimes. She tried to do the right thing. And you punished her for it. You planted false evidence. You had her arrested. You destroyed her reputation until there was nothing left." Grace's tears fell freely now, but her voice remained strong. "My mother died thinking she was a criminal in the eyes of the world. She died unable to prove the truth. I was 8 years old when I lost her." The entire hall was in absolute silence. Some guests were filming with their phones. Others were openly crying. Margaret stepped back, stumbling over her own feet. "This is a lie. It's all lies. Jonathan." She turned desperately to her son. "Jonathan, tell them this woman is lying." Jonathan stood up slowly. He walked to the stage. And then he did something that completely destroyed Margaret. "I've seen the documents, Mother." His voice was heavy with disappointment. "All of them. You made me believe my whole life that we were an honorable family. That our fortune was built on hard work. But it was built on lies. On the destruction of innocent people." "Jonathan, please." Margaret begged, grabbing her son's arm. "I did all of this for you. For our family. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Jonathan pulled away from her touch. "And I won't be complicit anymore." It was at that moment that an elderly woman stood up in the middle of the hall. Helena, the cook who had worked at the mansion for 12 years. The same Helena who lowered her eyes when Margaret humiliated the staff. "It was me," Helena said, her voice trembling but determined. "I sent the letters to Grace. I gave her the safe codes." Margaret looked at her in absolute shock. "You? Helena, I treated you like family." "No, Mrs. Whitmore. You treated me like a slave for 12 years." Helena walked forward, tears streaming down her aged face. "I watched you destroy dozens of innocent people. I watched you lie, manipulate, threaten. I stayed silent because I needed the job. But I couldn't carry this weight anymore." She looked at Grace. "I knew your mother, dear. Rose was the kindest person who ever worked in that house. She deserved justice." Grace hugged Helena, both crying together in the middle of that hall full of witnesses. Margaret looked around, desperate, searching for some ally. But she only found faces of horror, disgust, and condemnation. The same politicians who had kissed her hand minutes before now backed away, as if she had a contagious disease. "This isn't over," Margaret hissed, pointing at Grace. "You'll regret this. My lawyers will destroy you." "Your lawyers can't destroy the truth," Grace replied calmly. "And tomorrow, when the newspapers publish this entire story, the whole world will know who you really are." Police sirens began to sound outside the mansion. Someone had already called the authorities. And as two police officers entered the hall, Margaret Whitmore finally understood that the empire she had built on lies and cruelty was crumbling before her eyes. But what no one in the hall knew yet was that the revelations of that night were just the beginning. Because inside that black folder, there was one last document that Grace hadn't shown yet, a document that revealed an even bigger secret, a secret that connected Margaret Whitmore to something far darker than simple embezzlement. The document Grace hadn't yet revealed would change everything once again. As the police officers approached Margaret, Grace raised her hand asking for a moment. She pulled out one last sheet of paper from the folder, yellowed with time. "Before you take her away," Grace said, her voice echoing through the silent hall, "there's something everyone here needs to know. Something beyond the stolen money." Margaret froze. Her eyes widened as she recognized that document. "No," she whispered. "You can't." In 2004, when my mother was arrested, she was 4 months pregnant. Grace felt her voice falter, but continued. "The stress of prison, the inhumane conditions, the humiliation. She lost the baby in jail. I would have had a brother or sister." A devastating silence fell over the hall. Some people began to cry openly. "This document," Grace continued, holding the paper with trembling hands, "is the medical report from that day. And down here, there's a note written by Margaret Whitmore herself." She read aloud, "Problem solved. Now she'll have no reason to fight." The hall erupted in horrified murmurs. Jonathan covered his face with his hands, unable to look at his own mother. Margaret tried to run, but the police officers held her. "This is a lie. It's a forgery. My lawyers will prove that." "Your lawyers can't change the truth," the detective in charge said calmly, placing the handcuffs on her wrists. "Margaret Whitmore, you are under arrest for fraud, falsification of evidence, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." As Margaret was led outside, she passed by Grace. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no more arrogance in that gaze. Only fear. Only the belated understanding that all cruelty eventually demands its price. "You destroyed my life," Margaret hissed. Grace slowly shook her head. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. You destroyed your own life 20 years ago. I just turned on the light so everyone could see." The following months completely transformed everyone's lives. Margaret Whitmore was tried and sentenced to 15 years in prison for an extensive list of crimes including fraud, document falsification, and destruction of evidence. Her personal fortune was confiscated, and much of it was allocated to compensate the victims of her schemes over the years. In prison, she occupied a simple cell, without luxuries, without servants, without anyone to humiliate. The newspapers said she had aged 2 decades in just a few months. Jonathan Whitmore publicly took responsibility for fixing his family's wrongs. He completely restructured the Sunrise Foundation, this time with independent audits and total transparency. He created a special fund in Rose Williams's name to help women who had been wrongfully accused of crimes they didn't commit. And in a gesture that surprised everyone, he publicly apologized to Grace in a nationally broadcast interview. "I was a coward for years," he told the cameras, his voice heavy with emotion. "I saw signs of what my mother was, but I chose to ignore them. Grace Williams taught me that the truth cannot be buried forever. And that sometimes, the most unlikely person is the one who has the courage we lack." Helena, the cook who had been the anonymous informant, was rewarded with a generous retirement and her own apartment, a gift from Jonathan as thanks for her courage. At 67, she could finally rest without fear. "I spent 12 years in silence," Helena told Grace on the day she moved into her new home. 12 years carrying the guilt of not having done anything. You gave me the chance to finally do the right thing." Grace hugged her tightly. "You did more than the right thing, Helena. You gave me my mother back." And as for Grace? 6 months after that night at the ball, she was standing before a small memorial in the cemetery where her mother was buried. The headstone had been replaced with a new larger one, with an inscription that read, "Rose Williams, beloved mother, woman of courage, innocent forever. Aunt Dolores stood beside her, holding a bouquet of yellow flowers, Rose's favorites. "She would be so proud of you," Dolores said softly. Grace smiled through her tears. "I just wish she could see this. That she could know the world finally knows the truth." "She knows, my child. Wherever she is, she knows." Grace knelt and placed her hand on the cold earth. "I promised I would find justice, Mom. And I did. Not with hatred. Not with blind revenge. But with the truth. The same truth you fought for." The wind blew gently, rustling the leaves of the surrounding trees. And for a moment, Grace could have sworn she felt something warm envelop her. Like an embrace. Like a goodbye. Like a thank you. A year later, Grace Williams stood in a packed auditorium, receiving an investigative journalism award. She had written a book telling her mother's entire story, a book that became a bestseller and inspired thousands of people to fight for justice. "Many people ask me if it was worth it," Grace said in her acceptance speech. "If facing someone as powerful as Margaret Whitmore was worth all the risks. And my answer is always the same." She paused, looking at the audience. "My mother spent the last years of her life believing she was a criminal in the eyes of the world. She died carrying a shame that wasn't hers. No amount of money, no award, nothing can bring her back. But now, when someone searches for the name Rose Williams, they won't find a thief. They'll find a hero. A woman who had the courage to confront power and pay the highest price for it." Grace raised the trophy. "This isn't mine. This is hers. And it belongs to all the people who were silenced by those who think money and power are above the truth. The message I want to leave is simple: it doesn't matter how long it takes. It doesn't matter how powerful your enemy is. The truth always finds its way. And justice, even when delayed, always arrives." The audience rose in applause. And somewhere in a cold, silent cell, Margaret Whitmore watched the broadcast on the small prison television. Her wrinkled hands trembled. Her eyes were empty. She had spent her entire life destroying people she considered inferior. She had accumulated wealth at the expense of others' suffering. And now, in the end, she had nothing. No money. No power. Not a single person who cared about her. Grace's true revenge wasn't putting Margaret in prison. It was showing the world that the dignity of a simple cleaning lady was worth more than all the gold of the Whitmore family. And this is the lesson that remains. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what they say about you. It doesn't matter how many times they try to knock you down. Your truth is your most powerful weapon. And when you use it with courage and integrity, no castle of lies remains standing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments. Have you ever faced someone who thought they were untouchable? How was it? Because sometimes, karma just needs a little help from us to do its job.